So I think in general, this idea, completion creates space. And in space, we can create.
Welcome to Season 3 of Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations, with your host, Executive Leadership Coach and CEO of the Granger Network, Kari Granger, and me, Paul Adams, CEO of Sound Financial Group. This season focuses on trust. Hello and welcome to Leadership Impact. I'm your co-host, Paul Adams, and we are so happy to have all of you with us today because for many of you, you've been with us on this 1.5 year long journey of building this podcast so far. And Kari, we're getting a chance to end today the entire conversation around trust and simultaneously talk about what's next on the podcast.
Absolutely. And it's so important for us to create completions, conclusions, and endings, because without that, we don't have the space to create something new. So as we go about today, it's important that, we all bring this season and these seasons to a close.
Yeah, I think that moment for most people, the pause to say we are complete on X and we did it or we didn't do it, is something that's done not often enough, I think, sometimes in our personal and business lives. So Kari and I are going to actually get a chance to talk with all of you about completing something for us, which kind of started with Kari's original intention of what we would be able to do with this podcast over the last 1.5 years. First episode, Kari, October 2018.
Right. And, the intention was really to provide some practical tools and perspectives, a new way of doing leadership in our organizations. I just remembered I would go out and I would give talks and people would want to buy the book. Or, and I said, there isn't a book. I'm so sorry. Right. And so they'd get really excited and they have nothing to engage in. Or the number of people who don't have an opportunity to work with us, but want to continue their leadership journey. And even our current clients who, from a scaling perspective, really want to provide and to begin new conversations with their teams and their organizations. And, there's a real foundation that we find to being a high performing, transformative leader. And the foundation is really expressed in the 3 seasons: performance and leadership, accountability, and trust. And so, I'm really happy today to be able to say and to be able to acknowledge that we did that. We accomplished what we set out to do as we bring this last season of trust to a close.
Well, let's spend a little time talking about this season of trust. We kicked off with a case for trust, like why it matters, what difference does it make? Mm-hmm. And got into things like behaviors, trusting behaviors, distrusting behaviors. So people could actually identify it a bit in their own, be able to see it. But one of my favorites was episode 40. Yeah, episode 40 on cordial hypocrisy. And the kind of feedback I've gotten about that, about people just being able to open up the blinds, if you will, inside their organization and see that a bunch of people are running around being polite to each other and not trusting.
Oh my goodness. And it's so important. I have seen in so many situations where this cordial hypocrisy has prevented us from actually creating a trusting culture. And, if you do listen to the different episodes through the season, we realize that, trust enables us to take bigger risks, make big decisions, allows us to do things beyond what we could do on our own. And in case that sounds soft, you just think about the difference between having a team that avoids each other, withholds information, doesn't share ideas, protects their turf, versus a team that collaborates, shares different ideas, freely takes risks together, does not take credit for each other's ideas, but boosts each other up. And you can start to see why, according to a number of research studies, high trust organizations outperform the S&P 500 annualized returns by a factor of 3. So trust, we found, is not a soft skill. It's not a luxury item. And things like that cordial hypocrisy put your very bottom line at risk. So the rest of the season, we really look to provide some actionable tools, what you can do, the conversations and the actions you can take to build trust. So, we look to provide the skills. It's up to you to have the
Mhm.
will and the motivation to implement those skills.
And I think that, one thing we've suggested throughout all three seasons was that idea of take this episode, you just listen to it on your device, text it to somebody else in your organization, and have a cup of coffee over Zoom and talk about it. Because that conversation, having other people exposed to this idea of what it means to have a leadership impact, that rather than it just being, hey, I heard a good podcast, here's an episode, but that extra accountability Kari's talking about is both you implementing it, but also you sharing some of this and then being able to talk about it, because it will make a tremendous difference, not just in season 3 of Trust, but any of the episodes, which are now, I think in between episodes, everything was 47 total so far.
I think it was more than that. It might have been even 56.
That's why I said 57.
Like you said, 57. Does this make 58?
I don't know. I'm just remembering Lindsay saying that, but there's the other thing that I just don't want to walk away from and not say to you, Kari, is that this structure you've created, the thoughtfulness of what would be in every season, is rigorous to a standard that I haven't seen. Meaning, like there's other people out there that have podcasts, but rarely do you get a chance. And this is both in thanks to the audience and thanks to you personally, and thanks to the entire team at the Granger Network. But for me, I've never seen this kind of rigor that literally the team had nearly figured out what we were doing for the next 10 episodes all the time. And with that idea of here are the things we want to make sure the audience has in the way of tools. I think without that design, we would have gotten to 200 episodes and not covered this key content that now is present in all these episodes for people to be able to either get initially engaged in or go back in and review.
Oh, well, I appreciate that acknowledgement, Paul, and I'll certainly pass it on to our team. There is just this foundational arc that's, every leader should have when it comes to paradigm that they lead inside of, the way they relate to accountability, performance, and trust. And those listeners who have been consistent on the journey with us will find themselves able to lead in a way that they just couldn't have seen, 18 months prior. And, it really comes from a true desire to serve and a true desire to provide something of value that doesn't just make a difference for the leaders and the listeners, but those that they're in contact with. Better conversations, better relationships. That's really what we set out to do.
Well, yeah, I was thinking back, re-listening to the episode 0 of the podcast, and you saying, I'm at a conference with 3,000 people that come up and they want something for their teams. And the idea that this is going to impact, and I think we're starting to see that, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in their leadership journey get a chance to get exposed to the Granger Network for the first time, and many of these concepts maybe for the first time in bite-sized doses that they can send to somebody that they can listen. It's not a 3-hour podcast. Each one is bite-sized so that you can go have a cup of coffee with somebody. And if they forgot to listen to the episode, they can catch it on the drive over.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to just point out to that might be of value here is why Paul keeps saying share and have coffee, and talk about the episode. So why does he keep pointing us that way? Is because culture, whether it's a family culture or an organizational culture, is a function of the conversations we're having with each other. So I don't know, I can't remember if we ever spoke about culture on one of these episodes, but many of us, kind of like trust, relate to culture as this atmosphere, this glue, this thing you can't get your hands on. And or people will say, culture is the belief systems and the artifacts. And yeah, all of that contributes. But how you shift culture is you shift the conversations that are happening around you. And when you shift your conversation, it impacts the other person and it shifts their conversations with people. So why Paul keeps saying, send this and talk about it is because it's an opportunity to create new conversations, which are our access to shifting culture. And any one of these episodes support you in having new conversations.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up because it can sound like a little selfish. I want people to download the episode, but actually, what I want is for you listening to us right now to get the greatest amount of impact from the leadership impact. The idea of simply talking modifies your performance in talking with somebody else who's been exposed to it.
Yeah.
That's the thing that a lot of people forget. If we're not talking about it, it just disappears again.
Exactly. It doesn't happen in reflection alone. It happens in new conversations. Paul, this has been a new conversation for me, just to find a way to make a contribution to a group of people that I don't see, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I just really want to thank you. I have heard from so many people that our dynamic is one that enables them, our relationship, our dynamic, what we each contribute enables people to really be able to digest what we provide. And I know it's just not something I could have done on my own. I tried actually, and it failed really bad. Like I didn't even want to listen to the episodes. So I just so appreciate, what you bring to each of these. And I know that our listeners do too. I also want to say it's fun. You guys should hear the what's not on the recording. It takes us about 4 hours to record like 2 20-minute episodes because I don't know what we do, but it's really fun.
Well, and now we're completing ish the podcast, meaning we're in new conversations. We're actually recording this episode, and next week, 2 weeks from now, is scheduled our time to talk about what's next.
And we don't know what's next. It's possible that this is not just an end-isode, but a final-isode, and that the leadership impact comes to an end. Or it's possible that we may do special topics, like I've always wanted to do something specific on sales, or maybe more of, passion domains. Like, for me, an area of great passion is stakeholder capitalism and really having businesses thrive while all stakeholders thrive. And that would be a really different direction than the practical leadership tools that we've been providing. And so we have to see, does it fit in this podcast or is it something different? I don't know.
And that right there, and this is why I love where the things that you do at the Granger Network actually become evident to our audience. And how often do people knock out a project, they complete it, and then one of two things happen. They never have the conversation about it being completed. They jump right into the next thing without taking that pause to think through what's next.
Mm-hmm.
What are the aims for our organization? What's important to me personally? And should we be doing something next? And I think that doesn't happen often enough because we get so fast paced. We have now, thanks to social media, boiled down our attention span to that of a goldfish. So I think that's the thing that all too often doesn't happen, Kari, is that people don't pause, acknowledge that they completed something, and then reflect before engaging their human or financial capital to the next thing.
No, it's so good. I just finished leading an entire week on this exact topic. And where it came from is one of our dear, dear clients who is in the process of buying another company. And, what happens in acquisitions is people go through these huge transitions and they actually end, right, a whole era working in one company under one set of rules in succeeding in that way with those relationships. And they enter a whole new world. But when we don't take time to complete, to end, and we just thrust people into the next thing, it hampers our ability to perform well in the next thing. It hampers our ability to co-create what's next with people. There's not enough space there.
It'll leave people fighting for the way it was also.
Exactly. That's so well said. It leaves people fighting for the way it was and sometimes in a bit of a confused state as well, still operating in the old way but in a new environment. So I think in general, this idea, completion creates space. And in space, we can create.
Now, speaking of that space, because we're going to have this conversation after this episode publishes. And so we want to hear from all of you. Kari and I were talking about this before the recording. Please reach out to us. Send an email, direct message us on any of the social platforms, and let us know what, if anything, you might find interesting to come up on Leadership Impact next, or ideas for what you think the Granger Network should do next in terms of public-facing content.
Oh, that reminds me, we had this great, and it's a listener who's a dear relationship to me. He said, you know what we should do, Paul? We should do a whole podcast on what it is, or maybe it's a season, I'm not sure, about what it is to lead from the bottom, so to speak, of like the organizational chart.
Mm-hmm.
How do you lead an organization when you have no positional authority? And, we even joked we could call that the bottoms up season or bottoms up podcast. But that's another one we got to talk about when we talk in June. That's one of the ideas that has come from one of our listeners.
Well, now speaking of our listeners, I've just got to acknowledge them for a moment. Kari and I are looking right now at a list of things that all of you have said. One of my favorites was The Real Deal. Kari and Paul have tapped into the heart and soul of performance and leadership, the real drivers that impact how we see the world and interact with those around us.
Yeah, I love that.
We had another one say, I've listened to every episode twice now. It is that thought-provoking. Finally, something different, not your normal leadership story. This is way deeper, real and intriguing. I'm actually learning new stuff.
You know what I love about these is that I feel very acknowledged, because what I want to do is bring real stuff, not the fairy tale leadership, but the real stuff. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
And for all of you, we've loved what we've been able to see from you in the reviews. We've enjoyed reading the emails that Kari or I will get, and we end up sending back and forth among the Granger Network team. And it really means something to us too. And I think that all too often people can feel like you listen to a podcast, there's a host there, they're probably getting thousands of those messages. Everyone still makes a difference to Kari and I. So don't hesitate to send those.
So we just really want to thank you, our listeners. Without you, we would not have persisted as long as we have. So we're really grateful for you. Thank you for your listening. It has us see new things. I also just, want to acknowledge all the thought leaders that have contributed to us. So, just looking in this last season, we pulled a lot from Solomon and Flores, building trust in business, politics, relationships, and life. And, Dr. Fernando Flores himself has been a big impact in both of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Feltman just wrote this great little thin book on trust. I think he has been influenced by some of the same people we've been influenced by. Reina and their work, Julio Lala, even the book, Thanks for the Feedback, right? By Stone and Heen, and, your conversations or your research into Scott Adams. I know that he's been on your podcast and how fired up you were after interviewing him. And that's just for this season. I think each season that we've acknowledged a number of people, and so I just really want to be clear that we don't make these things up in a closet, that we're often, inputted and influenced by many people. And it's important to me to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Well, and so this is our completion of trust. It's our completion of the podcast as Kari had set out initially to be able to accomplish over the last year and a half. And it's an opening, because completing gives us a chance to open something new. It's not crowded out by what was. And we're just really looking forward to getting your feedback, what you think we could do that would be valuable to you. And then we're going to take all that in over the next month or so and a series of meetings to talk about it. So we really do want your feedback. So if I may, for what may or may not be the final time, let you know that from me, from Kari, from everyone at the Granger Network, we hope this entire podcast has been a contribution to your leadership impact. Thank you for tuning into Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations. Subscribe now at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.